She spent her nights sewing other people's wedding dresses so her sons could start first grade with everything they needed. Then the biggest order of her life came from the man who had no idea that for 6 years, 3 little boys had been growing up without him. Liza Carter sewed at night. During the day, her little atelier on the corner of Brooks Street looked almost respectable: light curtains, mannequins by the window, neatly hanging samples of lace, boxes of ribbons, a worktable with the sewing machine she guarded more carefully than the furniture at home. But the place truly came alive at night, when the street emptied, the sign Liza Carter Bridal and Alterations reflected on the wet asphalt, and she, bent over white fabric, sewed other people's happiness as though a life depended on the straightness of every stitch. In a way it did. Because in 2 months, her sons were supposed to start first grade. 2 identical boys, Luke and Leo. 6 years earlier, when the doctor said the word twins, Liza had cried from fear first, not joy. Fear had felt more honest then. She already knew she would be alone. What she did not yet know was just how hard that would be. Now the boys were almost 7. They had sunlightened chestnut hair, serious gray-brown eyes, and one question they asked in different ways but with the same pain every time: "Mom, why don't we have a dad on our school forms like the other kids?" Liza had learned to answer without breaking in front of them. "Because we have a different story, my loves." Luke accepted that silently, like an adult. Leo always looked at her for 1 second longer, as if trying to find exactly where the lie was hidden inside that answer. Tonight the boys were asleep on the little sofa in the back room of the atelier. After daycare, she no longer had time to take them home and then come back to work. Their backpacks stood by the door, and on the table lay a shopping list for school: notebooks, pencil cases, 2 identical blazers, shirts, shoes, gym uniforms. She had already counted the money 3 times, and every time the result had been the same: not enough. It was almost always not enough. But Liza had long since learned to live without panic at that thought. She simply worked one more night. The bell above the door rang unexpectedly. Liza lifted her head. At that hour, no one usually came in. A woman in her 40s stood on the threshold, wearing an expensive suit, holding a tablet, with the expression of someone used to speaking briefly and receiving agreement. "Are you Miss Carter?" she asked. "Yes. My name is Janet Miller. I represent Hartwell Events Group. We're looking for an independent atelier for an urgent bridal order." Liza tensed. An urgent order usually meant a lot of work, little sleep, and a chance to survive another month. "What kind of volume are we talking about?" 12 dresses for the wedding presentation of a new luxury project. The main bridal gown, a capsule line for bridesmaids, 2 evening looks, tailoring adjustments, possible changes in the final week. Our previous contractor failed us. Liza slowly set down the scissors. "That's a large project." "That's exactly why we're here. You were recommended to us as someone who can do the impossible on a short deadline." "Who recommended me? Does that matter?" "In my business, it always matters." Janet scrolled through her tablet. "One of our partners saw your work at last year's charity exhibition." Liza nodded, though her heart had already started beating faster for some reason. Something in the company's name had scratched unpleasantly at her memory. Hartwell. She knew that name too well. But there are lots of Hartwells in the world, she told herself. "What's the budget?" she asked. Janet named the amount. Liza did not at first understand that she had heard correctly. That money would cover not only school. It would cover rent for 3 months, a new overlocker, the old debt from Leo's treatment after bronchitis, and even, for the first time in a long while, allow her to buy the boys not whatever is cheapest, but exactly what they wanted. "Why are you coming to such a small atelier with a budget like that?" she asked. Janet looked at her directly. "Because the client wants handwork. And because the future bride refused everything that feels soulless and factory-made." The word bride passed through Liza almost automatically. "I need to see the brief." "Tomorrow at 10. At the main office. We'll discuss all the details there." Liza took the business card. Hartwell Events Group, Executive Director, Ethan Hartwell. The world did not collapse. It did not shake. It did not go dark. It simply, in 1 second, stopped being the same world. Ethan Hartwell. Her ex-husband. The man who had left her life 6 years earlier, convinced that she no longer wanted to see him. The man who didn't know about the children. The man she had forbidden herself, all this time, to think of not as a wound but as a person. Liza slowly raised her eyes to Janet. Who is the client? Janet, unaware that she was tearing open someone else's past, answered calmly, Mr. Hartwell. It's a wedding project for him. Liza felt her fingers go cold. He's getting married? Yes. And very soon. Janet kept talking, about confidentiality, deadlines, meetings, penalties, but Liza could barely hear her now. Because in the next room, 2 boys were sleeping, boys Ethan had never seen. And tomorrow morning she would have to sew wedding dresses for his new life. Liza barely slept that night. She kept looking from the boys curled up on the little sofa in their identical dinosaur pajamas, to the business card lying beneath the lamp as if it were not paper, but a summons from the past. Ethan is getting married. At first the thought felt humiliating, then painful, then almost ridiculous. Because nearly 7 years had passed since he vanished from her life. In that time, people are supposed to become strangers. They are supposed to gather new faces, new stories, new attachments. And yet something childish and unfair still remained inside her, asking, how can he get married if I still sometimes flinch when I hear his last name? In the morning she took Luke and Leo to daycare, lied that she had an important work meeting, put on the dark blue dress she saved for rare occasions, pinned up her hair, and arrived at Hartwell Events Group half an hour early, the way people do when they are afraid not of being late by the clock, but of being late to their own self-control. The office occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower downtown. White marble, cold light, living plant walls, the smell of expensive coffee, and the kind of silence in which you can hear how much the square footage costs. Liza gave her name at reception. Miss Carter? Yes, they're expecting you, the receptionist smiled. Not Liza. Not Mrs. Hartwell. Not a person from the past. Just a convenient seamstress. That, for some reason, helped a little. She was led into a conference room. Ethan entered 2 minutes later. If Liza had prepared for that meeting all her life, it still would not have been enough. He was older now, of course. The lines of his face were sharper, a nearly invisible seriousness had appeared at his temples and his dark hair, his gaze had grown deeper and harder. But he was still the same man she had once loved so fiercely that for a long time she confused love with the pain that followed him. Ethan stopped in the doorway. At first there was ordinary professional attention on his face. Then confusion. Then shock. Liza? Her breathing did not even falter. That infuriated her more than anything else. Good morning, Mr. Hartwell. Janet, already spreading out documents, looked from one of them to the other. You know each other? We did, said Liza. A very long time ago, Ethan said at the same time. Silence stretched like fabric before a tear. I can reschedule the meeting, Janet offered cautiously. No, Ethan said at once. Yes, Liza answered at the same time. They looked at each other. Too much of the past can always fit into a single glance like that. Stay, he said more quietly to her. Please. She should have left. That would have been reasonable. Clean. Safe. But the word please from his mouth after so many years sounded too human. Not like an order, not like power, not like the husband who had once been certain that everything between them was already dead. And Liza stayed. Janet started talking about the project, a private wedding ceremony, a closed presentation, no media access to the bride until the event day, a dress line built around the philosophy of second chances and mature love. That phrase sounded especially cruel. Liza stayed silent while they discussed fabrics, silhouettes, and deadlines. Ethan hardly intervened. He simply watched her as though trying to understand whether she was real, whether she was alive, or whether all of this was some delayed dream that had arrived at the wrong time. At last Janet finished and asked, "Miss Carter, are you willing to take it on?" Liza turned her eyes to Ethan. "Who is the bride?" Janet hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I don't believe that affects the work." "It does." This time Ethan answered himself. "Nobody's marrying me. Not yet." Liza frowned. "What?" He gave a tired half-smile. "Janet told you this was a wedding for me?" "I was told that yesterday at the atelier." Janet went pale. "I assumed you meant your project with Miss Bell." Ethan covered his eyes with a hand for a second, as if he himself had grown tired of the sheer level of other people's misunderstandings. "It's not my wedding. It's a contract for a collection for the premium bridal line we're launching with Amelia Bell's brand. It's her wedding campaign, not mine." Liza did not at first understand what she was feeling. The relief was so humiliating that it almost made her angry at herself. "I see," she said, though apparently not very convincingly. Ethan was watching her too closely. "You thought I was getting married?" "It doesn't matter." "For you, not at all?" he asked very quietly. Janet wisely stood up. "I think I'll go get more fabric samples." When the door closed, the air changed. They were alone for the first time in 7 years. Ethan took one step toward the table, but no closer than that. "You disappeared," he said. Liza gave a dry laugh. "That's an interesting thing to hear from you." "No. Liza, you really disappeared. I came back to Boston 3 days later. The apartment was empty. Your phone was disconnected. The neighbors said you had left. I was given a letter." She froze. "What letter?" He looked at her directly. "Don't look for me. I don't want you to be part of this life. It will be better this way." Liza went pale. "I never wrote that letter." Now he froze. The world sometimes begins to crack exactly like that, not with shouting, but with one quiet sentence behind which a whole abyss is suddenly visible. "What?" he asked. Liza slowly shook her head. "I never wrote you anything. I waited for you for 4 days." He stood motionless. "No, yes. That's impossible. Too many impossible things have happened in my life, Ethan. They still happened." He dragged a hand over his face. "Liza, what happened after I left?" She looked him in the eyes. And for the first time in many years, she decided not to spare him. "I found out I was pregnant. Then I found out it wasn't just one child." He went so pale that even she was afraid for a second. "What?" "Twins," she said, then let the pause slice through him completely. Then at the next ultrasound it turned out the doctors had made a mistake. There were 3. He stared at her, as if he no longer understood human speech. "Children," he breathed. Liza held his gaze. "Yes, Ethan. You have sons. And they start first grade in 2 months." He slowly sank into a chair, never taking his eyes off her. In the silence that followed, you could hear beyond the glass the hum of the city, a life that had suddenly become meaningless next to 3 small boys he had never known existed. "My God," he whispered. Liza stood. "No. Don't do God right now. You can just sit with the truth. I've been doing that for 6 years." And she walked out of the conference room, leaving him alone with what had grown from their past without him. Ethan drove to his mother's that same evening. Vivian Hartwell's house looked exactly as it always had, perfect roses by the entrance, heavy curtains, polished marble, air in which even silence seemed trained. His mother sat in the winter salon with a book, as if this day were no different from any other. "You're early," she said without looking up. "I thought you had a meeting with investors." "I have 3 sons." The book closed slowly. Vivian looked up. And she was not surprised. Everything inside Ethan turned cold. "You knew," he said. It was no longer a question. I knew about the pregnancy, she answered calmly. About the pregnancy? I have 3 6-year-old children, Mother. 3. And you say it like we're talking about the weather. Vivian set the book aside. You were not in a condition to become a father then. And so you decided you had the right to steal my children? I decided I had the right to protect you from destruction. He laughed. Shortly. Emptily. Protect me? Do you want to know what your protection looked like from my side? For 6 years I lived believing Liza had left because she no longer wanted me. And in reality she was waiting for me, pregnant, with 3 children. Vivian pressed her lips together. She was a weak woman for the life you were moving toward. And I, apparently, was too valuable to know about my own sons. Yes, she said sharply. Exactly that. You were standing on the threshold of the deal that determined everything. Your father's company was hanging by a thread. One scandal, one emotional catastrophe, 3 children born in chaos, and you would have buried everything. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. You're a monster. No. I'm a mother who understood the price of your future. You didn't understand the price of my present. She rose. That's enough dramatics. The children are alive. She survived. She has an atelier. It's not as tragic as it feels to you right now. Ethan stepped closer. She was sewing wedding dresses at night so she could send my sons to 1st grade. Vivian flinched for the first time. Only for a second. It was enough. Who wrote the letter? He asked quietly. The one where she supposedly begged me not to look for her. His mother was silent. And into that silence, the truth entered. You, he said. I did what was necessary. No. You did what was convenient for you. Vivian turned away toward the window. You would have hated her later. For her weakness. For the domestic mess. For the endless dependence. I removed it before it could destroy you. Ethan felt the floor give way beneath not just his version of the marriage. His whole family was collapsing. Did you ever love anyone besides the idea of power? He asked. She turned back sharply. Careful. No. Today caution is over. He walked toward the door. If you come anywhere near Liza or the boys, I will bring all of it into the light. The letter, the lies, the forgery. You're meddling in my father's company. All of it. You're threatening me? He looked at her tiredly. No, Mother. For the first time, I simply stopped being your son before I finally became a father. And he left. But the worst part was not waiting beyond Vivian's door. It was inside the envelope Grace, his younger sister, brought him an hour later. Inside was a copy of an old private investigator's report. And it proved that Liza's disappearance had not been orchestrated by their mother alone. Someone inside his own company had also worked very hard to make sure she could never reach him. Liza had no intention of showing him the children. At least not right away. Her anger had long since stopped being a storm. It had become a system of self-protection. She knew how dangerous late returns by men could be, men whom life had suddenly caught up with through guilt. Especially when the matter involved not only a woman, but children, for whom a stranger can become as much a disaster as a hope. But fate, as always, decided otherwise. The next day Ethan came to the atelier not alone. Grace was with him, his younger sister, whom Liza had almost forgotten. The same quiet girl with kind eyes who, years ago at family dinners, had seemed like the only person capable of feeling awkward about the luxury around her. Now Grace held a folder and looked as though she had come not to plead, but to confess guilt on behalf of an entire family. Liza opened the door and said at once, "No." Ethan nodded. "I understand." "No, you don't?" "Then at least listen not to me. To her." Grace stepped forward. "Liza, please. This will take 5 minutes." Liza wanted to slam the door. But from the back room came the sound of the boys laughing, and somehow that made her stay where she was. Silently, she stepped aside and let them in. By day, the atelier looked almost cozy. Spools of thread lay on the floor, an unfinished gown stood on the mannequin by the window, scissors, chalk, and tea she had forgotten to finish sat on the worktable. Behind the curtain separating the work area from the tiny living space came children's voices. Ethan stood as though he had stepped not into an atelier, but into a church. This, Grace said, setting the folder on the table, is a copy of an internal investigation from 6 years ago. Our senior operations director, Marcus Lane, was conducting negotiations behind Ethan's back in those months. He had direct access to Ethan's correspondents, assistants, and lawyers. Together with Vivian, he blocked all your messages, then used your disappearance to push through the very deal that made Ethan completely dependent on the board. Liza looked at her silently. And, she finally asked, does that make anything better? Grace lowered her eyes. No. But it does mean he wasn't lying to you. He really didn't know. Ethan did not move. I'm not asking you to forgive me quickly, he said. Or at all. But I'm asking one thing, let me see them. Liza clenched her fingers so hard her knuckles went white. You think it's easy for me to say no? She asked quietly. You think I haven't imagined this 1,000 times? How you would learn how they laugh, how Luke is afraid of the dark, how Leo gets angry when he struggles with reading, how Mason pretends he's the oldest even though he was born last. You think I never thought about what it would have been like if you had shown up on time just once? Ethan closed his eyes. Mason. A third name. He repeated it silently, like a prayer. I only know one thing, he said, opening his eyes. If you tell me to go now, I'll go. But then I'll stand outside as long as it takes until one day I've earned at least the right to be a familiar man at the door. He said it without drama, which made it dangerous. Because it sounded real. Liza had just opened her mouth to answer. But the curtain moved on its own. 3 boys stood there. Identical. Dark blonde hair, brown eyes, equally wary faces. One held a toy airplane, the second a picture book, the third a slice of apple. They froze when they saw the unfamiliar man. Ethan did not move. Because if he had, he might simply have fallen. 3. Alive. His. Luke looked at his mother first. Mom, who is that? Liza didn't answer in time. Mason, the one with the airplane, suddenly stepped forward and said very seriously, he looks like us, only big. The room became impossible to breathe in. Ethan slowly sank down to his knees right on the atelier floor. Not for effect. Because his legs no longer held him. Leo narrowed his eyes. Is he crying? Grace turned away. Liza stood motionless, feeling her heart beating in her throat. Ethan tried to speak, but his voice broke. Then he looked at the 3 boys and said the simplest and most terrifying truth of his life. I'm your dad. No one screamed. No one gasped. No one ran into his arms. Children don't do that. They just look first. Luke asked the first question. Then why did you take so long to come? And Liza closed her eyes. Because some questions, asked in a small voice, break harder than years of loneliness. Ethan answered immediately. Because I was a very stupid grown-up. And because I was lied to. But the fact that I didn't come is still my fault. Mason thought about that and nodded. That's honest. Leo suddenly asked, can you read dinosaur books in different voices? And Liza understood, that was it. The wall had cracked for the first time. Because children aren't about ideology. They're about who stays long enough to read dinosaur books in different voices. But at that very moment, the phone rang. Liza answered, listened for a few seconds, and went pale. The school was calling. The preparatory enrollment fee had to be paid by the end of the week, or the boys' places would go to other children. Ethan understood it all from her face before she said a word. And for the first time in years, what he felt was not simply guilt. It was fury at how much time had been stolen from him not only as a man, but as a father. 2 days later, the bride came to the atelier. Liza had not expected her in person. She assumed she would work through Janet and technical fittings. But at noon the door opened, and a tall woman in a white pantsuit stepped inside, with perfect posture and the sort of beauty impossible not to notice. Amelia Bell. The face of the new bridal brand. Society's darling, designer, the woman whose name had been printed beside Ethan's in the business press so often in recent months that Liza had grown tired of telling herself it meant nothing. Amelia entered calmly, looked around, and smiled. So this is where you make miracles? Liza did not smile. How can I help you? Amelia removed her gloves. With the truth, perhaps. There has already been far too little of it around me. Liza grew wary. I don't understand. You do, Amelia said gently. And let's not waste time on polite lies. You decided I was the woman Ethan wanted to marry. Liza stayed silent. Denying it would have been ridiculous. Amelia gave a faint smile. There has never been anything between Ethan and me. No affair, no engagement, no plans to marry. He invested in my brand as an investor and as a friend of my late sister. But the board and the press adored hinting that the new perfect couple made a beautiful market narrative. I didn't object. It was useful. Up to a point. Liza felt something unpleasant turn over in her chest. Too many false pictures. Too many invented stories. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Amelia looked at her directly. Because yesterday I saw him with the boys. Liza went pale. He brought you? No. I came myself. Why? Amelia slowly sat in the fitting chair. Because over the years I've seen many men perform repentance beautifully. And for the first time, I saw one who looked as though half his body had just been torn away and handed back to him in the wrong order. Liza rubbed her forehead tiredly. I don't need intermediaries. I'm not an intermediary. I'm just a woman who's tired of being part of other people's legends. And to be honest, I'm here for myself too. I'm tired of being used as a convenient screen for male fear, family schemes, and business arrangements. The silence became different. Cleaner. Do you love him? Liza asked suddenly. Amelia was not surprised. No. But I respect him very much. And because of that, I won't build a brand on a story that is still harming living people. Liza nodded slowly. It was unsettling how badly this woman fit the role of enemy. Then why did you keep letting it continue? Amelia looked out the window. Because sometimes it's easier to be a beautiful myth than a real person with principles. But yesterday, when one of your boys grabbed Ethan's sleeve and asked whether he'd come again tomorrow, I realized, if I keep letting the world believe we're a couple, I become an accomplice. Liza lowered her eyes. Yes. Yesterday Mason really had asked, Are you coming tomorrow? Or is this one of those grown-up things, once and then never again? And Ethan had answered, I'll come. And today he had. With an easel for drawing, because Luke had quietly confessed the day before that he dreamed of drawing airplanes like real engineers. Amelia stood. I'm not asking you to trust him quickly. And I'm certainly not asking you to love him again. But if it helps, know this, you have no rival. You only have a past that's spent too long pretending to be the future for all the wrong people. She was already at the door when Liza asked, Why doesn't it hurt you to give up a story that was good for you? Amelia turned back. For the first time, there was weariness on her face. Because I once lost my sister to a man who chose a convenient image over the truth. I don't want to be the woman beside whom the same thing happens again to someone else. When the door closed, Liza stood in the middle of the atelier for a long time, staring at the white mannequin by the window. Life was changing again, not through romance. Through the refusal of lies. And that evening, while Ethan read the boys a dinosaur book in different voices, she caught herself thinking something so frightening it nearly hurt. Her pain was no longer the only thing connecting them. Ethan paid the school fee the next day. Not directly. He simply came that evening with 3 identical envelopes, set them on the table, and said, "This isn't a gift. It's part of what I should have done a long time ago." At first Liza refused. Harshly. Almost sharply. "I don't want you buying your way to them." He held her gaze. "I'm not buying anything. I'm returning stolen time, at least in the only form I still can." She tightened her fingers around the envelopes. "And if I still can't forgive you for it? Then at least the boys will go to school without feeling like they are extra." And that was the whole horror of his new honesty. She could no longer be angry at it as simply as before. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He did not push. He simply stayed. Within a week, the boys were already waiting for him almost as naturally as children wait for rain after heat. Luke pulled him to the table with airplane drawings. Leo made him read aloud and got furious if Ethan skipped the Tyrannosaurus voices. Mason tested the one thing that mattered, whether he kept his word. "You'll come Saturday?" he'd ask. "I'll come." "And if there's work?" "I'll come after work." "And if it's important?" "You're more important." And Mason would still watch him for one more second, as if checking whether the truth inside him matched the words he had spoken. One night Liza woke to silence. That particular, children's, wrong kind of silence that is more frightening than crying. The boys' room was empty. She ran into a hallway barefoot, already choking on panic, and saw light in the kitchen. All 3 boys were there. And beside them, Ethan, who had come by late after a meeting and, not wanting to wake her, had quietly checked on the sleeping boys. Leo was crying. His first tooth had fallen out, and the blood had scared him so badly that he woke his brothers. Luke was holding himself together, as always, in silence. Mason was trying to be grown up and only sniffled. Ethan sat with them at the table explaining that losing teeth was normal, that blood wasn't always catastrophe, and that growing up sometimes looked scary without meaning something was broken. Liza stopped in the doorway and suddenly understood how unfair the heaviest moments of happiness are. Because those are the moments that hurt the most. Because it becomes so easy to imagine this could have been their ordinary life all along. He noticed her. "It's okay," Ethan said quietly. She nodded. But the truth was that nothing was okay. It was worse. Because she suddenly saw the house that could have existed years ago. Morning breakfasts. Arguments over socks. Parent-teacher meetings. Colds. Laughter. An ordinary life. The one that had been stolen from them. Later, when the boys were asleep, they stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and Liza wrapped her arms around herself. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked. "What?" "I'm starting to see you not as the man who ruined everything, but as the one who should have been here from the beginning." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have been." "Yes. But you weren't." He nodded. "Yes. And I don't know what to do with that." He looked at her with such exhausted honesty that it became hard to bear his eyes. "Nothing. For now, nothing. Just don't push that truth back into the dark." The next day brought another turn. Grace found, in their late father's archive, not only documents about Marcus Lane's manipulations. She found a deed to a little house by the river. A house Richard Hartwell had bought a month before his death. In the name of Liza and Ethan's future children. The documents had never been delivered. Clearly, Vivian had intercepted those 2. When Liza held the papers in her hands, she was shaking. "All this time?" "Yes," Ethan said dully. "All this time you could have had a house." She laughed. Hollowly. Almost madly. "You know, that's almost too much. First they stole my husband. Then they stole children from their father. Then they stole school, a house, a normal life. What's next, Ethan? We find out my boys were actually born in a golden cradle and I just happened to live in poverty by mistake?" He stepped closer. "No. We found out only one thing: that you survived without everything you should have had. Which means you are stronger than my whole family put together. She turned away. Because those were the most dangerous words of all. They don't cause instant forgiveness. They make forgiveness possible. And believing in that was more frightening to her than pain. Moving into the house by the river did not feel like a miracle. Miracles are easy, beautiful, and on time. What they had was different. Boxes. Children's arguments. Exhaustion. Fear. Lawyers formalizing what should have been formalized long ago. Bills. Repairs. Old windows that let in drafts. Stains on the floor. Dust in the attic. And still, the feeling that from the ruins, something was slowly being assembled not as decoration, but as life. The boys were happy. The river house became an entire universe to them at once. Luke found an old set of tools in the shed and decided he would become an engineer. Leo declared that now he would have a room for great thoughts, although in reality he simply filled a corner with books. Mason was the first to run to the water and say, "You can grow here for real." Liza turned away then so she wouldn't cry. Ethan did not move in with them right away. He came every day, stayed late, helped, picked up the boys, repaired cabinets, assembled desks, hung shelves, took Luke for his first school physical, and taught Leo not to be afraid of the teacher who looks too serious. He did all of it as though he were not building his way back to Liza, but simply catching up to the normal life he had missed. One evening, while Ethan was hammering a nail into the porch railing, Mason asked, "So are you going to keep coming all the time now?" The question was asked calmly. But it held everything. Ethan set the hammer down. "I don't want to keep coming. I want to be here." Mason thought about that. "That's better." On the other side of the porch, Liza froze with a mug in her hands. Those were exactly the moments when the heart finally breaks for good, not from pain, but from beginning to believe. Later, when the boys were asleep, Ethan found her in the little sewing room off the house. She was laying out fabric for a new dress, though she should have been asleep long before. "You're sewing at night again," he said. "I've always sewn at night." "You don't have to anymore." She raised her eyes to him. "Don't take that from me." He immediately shook his head. "I'm not talking about the work. I'm talking about survival." The silence between them became different. Not hostile. Deep. "You really aren't marrying Amelia?" she asked suddenly. For the first time, he smiled the way he used to. More alive. "No, and you never were going to?" "No, then why didn't you stop all those rumors?" He sighed. "Because it was easier. They covered the hole I didn't want to admit was there. As long as I looked like a man who had everything under control, no one asked why I was actually living like a man with an empty house inside." She lowered her gaze to the fabric. "I had an empty house too." "I know." "No," she said quietly. "Now you know." He stepped closer. Not abruptly. Not insistently. The way one approaches a frightened animal, or a very precious memory. "Liza." She looked up. "What?" "I'm not asking you to give me back what we had. I'm not even sure we have the right to think about it that way. But I'm asking you to let me build with you whatever might still be possible." Her fingers trembled against the fabric. "And if I'm still afraid? Then I'll stay beside that fear. For as long as it takes." She was silent for a long time. Too long for a beautiful answer, and too honest for a refusal. Then she said very quietly, "I'm still angry at you." "I know. And maybe I always will be. Maybe. And sometimes I still want to hate you more, so I don't have to feel." She broke off. "What?" he asked barely above a whisper. Liza closed her eyes for a second. Then opened them. "That you're still my home." This time he did not answer at once. Because some words cannot be met too quickly. He simply stepped closer and very carefully, as if asking permission without words, touched her cheek. She did not pull away. And that became their first true return to each other. Not a confession. Not a kiss. Not a promise. But the absence of a step backward. By the 1st of September, Liza had finished the main wedding gown for Amelia Bell's project. It stood on the mannequin in the atelier at the new house, white, light, with delicate hand embroidery across the bodice and a long skirt that moved as if it never touched the floor. A dress about second chances, as Janet liked to say. About mature love. About how beauty after pain looks quieter, but deeper. Amelia came in person for the final fitting. She turned slowly before the mirror, was quiet for a long time, and then suddenly said, "Strange." "What exactly?" Liza asked, adjusting the hem. "I'm supposed to be the face of the bridal brand. I'm supposed to embody the perfect bride. And I'm standing here realizing this dress isn't about me at all." Liza smiled slightly. "Then who is it about?" Amelia met her eyes in the mirror. "About a woman who already knows the price of loss and still hasn't forgotten how to sew white." The atelier fell quiet. Then Amelia added suddenly, "Keep it after the shoot." Liza laughed. "What?" "I'm serious. I'm not going to marry in it anyway. And maybe one day you'll need it." Liza was about to protest but did not have time. Because just then a car rolled into the yard, and 3 boys leapt out, followed by Ethan wearing the expression of a man who had just lost a very important battle. "What happened?" Liza asked at once, alarmed. "Nothing terrible," he said quickly, though the boys' faces made it clear that something had happened and, very likely, something catastrophic by their standards. "They just decided to walk to school by themselves tomorrow." Luke nodded seriously. "We're big," Leo added, "but Mom, honestly, it was Mason's plan." Mason crossed his arms. "I wanted to make sure we knew the way." Liza closed her eyes. Amelia snorted with laughter. Ethan came closer and said quietly, "I found them 3 blocks from here. With their backpacks. With apples. And with a map Luke drew himself." Liza looked at the boys, 3 identical, stubborn, alive, noisy boys. At the man beside them. At the white dress in the mirror. And suddenly understood that happiness was nothing like what she had imagined at 24. It was not smooth. Not ceremonial. Not flawless. It smelled like children's sweat, a new house, late-night conversations, fear that had not completely disappeared, and love that had had to grow back from the bones of an old life. The next morning they all walked to school together. Luke held himself straight and important. Leo talked nonstop to hide how nervous he was. Mason kept checking whether everyone was still beside him. At the school gate they stopped. The boys wore identical dark blue blazers, the very blazers for which Liza had once taken on the impossible order. "Mom," Leo asked, "are you going to cry?" "No," she lied. "You are," Mason said with certainty. And he was right. She cried. Not from grief. From the fact that all 3 of them had reached this day alive, healthy, loved. And that beside her stood the man who had once been late, but had still managed to come. When the boys disappeared through the school doors, Liza wiped her tears and exhaled. "Well, 1st grade." "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "Our 1st grade." She did not correct him. On the contrary. For the first time, that word did not wound her. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Liza found the white gown on the porch, the one Amelia had truly sent after the shoot, with a short note. "Every dress deserves its own right ending." Ethan came out after her. He saw the dress. Then her. "Will you try it on?" he asked. She gave a small smile. "What is this, a proposal without a ring?" "No. A question without pressure." Liza looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the dress and went inside. When she came back out, he froze. It fit perfectly. As though all this time it had been sewn not for a brand, not for a display, not for someone else's beautiful legend. For her. Liza stood barefoot on the wooden floor in a white dress, her hair loose, no veil, no stage, no guests, simply a woman who had lost too much and yet remained alive enough to look like a bride again. Ethan stepped closer very slowly. "You're beautiful," he said. She looked at him calmly for a long moment. "I know," she answered. And suddenly he laughed, from relief, from love, from the fact that exactly that answer was the only right one. "I don't want beautiful promises anymore," Liza said. "They break too easily. You don't need them. But I do want one thing. If we choose each other again, I want it not to be because the past caught up with us. I want it to be because the present is finally strong enough." He nodded. "Yes. And I want the boys never again to live in a house where love depends on someone else's will. Never. And I want you never again to let anyone decide for you what family is." He came one step closer. "I won't." She looked at him. Then slowly held out her hand. He took it. No grand gesture. No music. No promises of forever. But in that touch there was something more precious than any old vow. Neither of them was any longer the person who had once been torn away from the other. Sometimes a happy ending is not getting back the years that were stolen. Sometimes it is building a home anyway, out of whatever remains after them. And the dress a woman once sewed for someone else's wedding becomes, one day, the first honest dress of her own new life. To me, this story is first and foremost about how terribly human lives can break when other people begin making decisions for them. I wanted to show that some of the deepest tragedies happen not because love was absent, but because of outside control, fear, class pride, and the cold certainty with which someone decides they know what kind of life is right for others. Liza, to me, is the image of a woman who did not simply survive loss, but learned to build a life literally out of fabric, exhaustion, sleepless nights, and maternal love. She is not perfect, not endlessly forgiving, and she does not turn into a polished legend of female strength. She is tired, alive, sometimes sharp, sometimes fragile, and that is exactly why she feels real to me. Her strength is not in grand speeches, but in the fact that she keeps holding together a home, her children, and herself even when there is no help and the past seems impossible to recover. Ethan matters to me not as the rich ex who realized everything too late, but as a man who allowed himself to live through the filters of other people's will for far too long. His tragedy is that he was not the main villain, but his weakness, his trust in the wrong people, and his willingness not to check the truth made all the destruction possible. It was important to me to show that real remorse does not begin with beautiful words, but with the willingness to remain when no one is obliged to forgive you. This story is also, to me, about the fact that children often become the most honest point of truth. Where adults build versions, excuses, strategies, and defensive walls, a child can destroy everything false with a single question and bring a person back to what matters. That is why the son's storyline in this story is not just emotional for me, it is central. Can you truly forgive someone who did not betray you on purpose, but was too weak to protect you and your children from someone else's cruelty when it mattered most?